John chapter 1, starting with verse 48, here's what it says. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. We're going to take a few minutes and talk about the miracle of the incarnation this morning. And all that word incarnation means is to be made flesh. Okay, so as we see here in verse 14, we're told that the Word became flesh. But what is the Word? Well, John answered that question for us back in verse 1, where he says that in the beginning was the Word, which means that the Word is eternal, right? The Word's been around from the very beginning, and the Word was with God. So the Word existed in relationship with God, not separate and apart from God, but with God, and the Word was God. So just in case we didn't catch it the first two times, John makes it really clear the third time that the Word is God. And so when John says in verse 14 that the Word became flesh, what he's saying is that God became flesh. And notice he doesn't say that the Word put on flesh. In other words, God didn't put on flesh like a costume and dress up like a human being, but God actually became a man. The Word became flesh. And so the Son of God, who is eternal and who has existed from the very beginning, who has been with God and is God, actually became something that he previously was not, and that is a human being. And he didn't just indwell a human being, right? It's not like God chose someone who was already alive and said, I'm going to come down and take over that guy. Like, that's not how it happened. He became a man by being born as a baby, just like you and me. And it wasn't an act. It wasn't a costume. God himself literally became a baby. I mean, it's mind-blowing when you really stop and think about it. J.I. Packer, in his book, Knowing God, says it this way: the Almighty appeared on earth as a helpless human baby, unable to do more than lie there and stare and wriggle and make noises, needing to be fed and changed and taught to talk like any other child. And there was no illusion or deception in this. The babyhood of the Son of God was a reality. The more you think about it, the more staggering it gets. The Word became flesh. God became a baby. Now, there's two mistakes people often make when they try to make sense of this miracle, because let's face it, it's a pretty difficult thing to wrap your head around. God becoming a man. And so people try to rationalize it, make sense of it. And when they do, they usually make one of two mistakes in the process. And the first mistake is this: they downplay the reality of Jesus' humanness and act like he wasn't a real human being like you and me, but something different. In other words, God couldn't possibly have come to earth in such a way that he had the same kind of weaknesses and frailties that we have in our bodies. I mean, he's God. How is that even possible? Now, it is true that Jesus had no sin, and so in that way, he was different than us. But in every other respect, he was the same. I mean, it's not like he was Superman, right? John doesn't say the Word became the man of steel. He didn't arrive in a little capsule from outer space. He was born just like you and me. Unto us a child is what? Born, right? Jesus was born. Now, having said that, just because Jesus was born as a baby, that doesn't make him any less God. Because that's the other mistake people often make when they try to make sense of the incarnation. On one hand, it's a mistake to say that Jesus wasn't a real human being like you and me. But on the other hand, it's a mistake to say that he wasn't really God, or that he was less God than what he was before. And so the miracle of the incarnation is that God became flesh, not by diminishing or subtracting from who he was, but by adding to himself something that he previously wasn't: flesh and blood. And not the appearance of flesh, not a costume, but actual flesh and blood, with all of the weaknesses and the frailties that go along with that. And we see that in the Gospels, don't we? We see times when Jesus was thirsty, times when he was troubled in spirit and openly wept. We especially see it at the cross, where Jesus not only thirsts, but he bleeds and he dies. And then after he dies, he doesn't abandon his body forever and become a spirit again, but his body is resurrected, which is a truth about the nature of God that I think often gets overlooked. Jesus never stops being human. It's not like a role that he played for 33 years and then went back to being just a spirit again. What we celebrate this time of year, the incarnation of the Son of God, is a permanent miracle. 2,000 years ago, God added to his divine nature a human nature, and he will retain that human nature for all eternity. That's the miracle of the incarnation. It's incredible. But why did it have to happen? Why did the eternal Son of God have to become a human being like you and me? Well, to answer that question, I'd like to read a passage out of Hebrews chapter 2. In speaking about Jesus, the writer of Hebrews says this in chapter 2 and verse 17. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. And so Jesus had to be made like us in every respect, because without the incarnation, there is no propitiation, which totally clears everything up, right? Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Can't we just say Merry Christmas and leave it at that? Right? What's with all of these big words? But I promise you, before we're done this morning, you are going to love this word, because it is the reason why we celebrate Christmas. Christmas is the day that we celebrate when God became a baby. And that baby's name was what? Jesus. But what does Jesus mean? See, every name in the Bible has a meaning. Samson, for instance, means strong. Paul means small. But what does Jesus mean? Well, in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 21, an angel appears to Joseph and says this about his fiancée Mary. He says that she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Now, Jesus wasn't the only kid named Jesus back then. Did you know that? In fact, Jesus was a very popular name. Parents would often name their sons Jesus or Joshua, which is the Hebrew version of that name. And they would name their sons that in anticipation of God's salvation, because that's what Jesus or Joshua or Yeshua means, God's salvation. But unlike other children who were given that name in anticipation of God's salvation, this child, Mary's child, will actually be the one responsible for bringing it all about. For he, the angel says, he will save his people from their sins. Now that's something else entirely. This child's name is Jesus, not because he anticipates the salvation of the Lord. This child's name is Jesus because he is the salvation of the Lord. The one who will save his people and save them from what? From their sins. And that is where that word propitiation comes in. See, just like the word incarnation describes something very big, the incredible event where the eternal Son of God becomes a flesh and blood baby. Just like the word incarnation describes something big, the word propitiation describes something big as well. An incredible act of grace and truth, of mercy and justice, where Jesus takes upon himself the judgment that we deserve because of our sin. See, the news that a king is born in Bethlehem is not good news if you've rebelled against that king. But that's why the king's name is Jesus. Because the king has come not to judge his people for their sins. The king has come to take that judgment upon himself and save his people from their sins. That's what John means in verse 14 when he says that the Son of God is full of grace and truth. See, Jesus is full of truth, right? He is the truth. He said it himself, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But Jesus isn't just full of truth, Jesus is also full of grace. And listen, if he wasn't, if Jesus was just full of truth and justice and no grace, we'd all be in a heap of trouble. Christmas would be the day we celebrate when God came to earth to wipe us all out. And that wouldn't be much of a celebration. But see, Jesus isn't just full of truth, he's also full of grace. And so what did he do? He was obedient to the point of death in order to save us from our sins and the judgment to come. But not only that, not only did Jesus come to save us from judgment, but he also came to provide a way for us to know God and to know him in a way that wasn't possible before. That's why later on in verse 18, John says this, no one has ever seen God. God, the only Son, who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. And so the Word became flesh, not just to save us from the wrath of God, but to show us God and to make a way for us to know him. And we see that spelled out for us here in the verse that we started with this morning. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. See, that word dwelt comes from the Greek word skinao, which literally means to put up a tent. The Word became flesh and put up a tent among us. Now, I'll be honest with you, tents aren't something that I'm a huge fan of. I prefer 4 walls, a roof, and a bed, okay? And a swimming pool and a hot tub and a breakfast buffet, because as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to accommodations, a tent seems way too temporary. Like that's what I think of when I think of a tent. I think, yeah, that's not going to be there very long, especially if I put it up. But I mean, even the tents that we see in the Bible were temporary, right? The tent of meeting, for instance, the one that Moses met with God in, that tent was temporary. And the tabernacle itself, where the Ark of the Covenant was held, and the Holy of Holies, that was a tent that gotten taken down and moved around a lot. Every time the Israelites moved to another location in the wilderness, that tent came down. So the illustration John uses here about how the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, or put up a tent among us, seems to make sense because, well, Jesus was only on this planet for 33 years. And compared to how long the Son of God has actually existed, which is forever, 33 years doesn't seem like that long of a time, does it? And so it looks like what John is trying to communicate here when he says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, or put up a tent among us, is that Jesus' time here on earth was temporary. But see, there's a problem with that. Because when you go to this other book that John wrote, the book of Revelation, John says this in chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them. And by the way, that's the word, that word dwell is the same word in John chapter 1 that means to put up a tent. So he will put up a tent with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. And so John uses the same word here that he used to describe when Jesus became a baby 2,000 years ago. Only now the context is heaven and eternity, which isn't temporary at all. In fact, eternity is about as far away from temporary as you can possibly get. So what is John saying here in verse 14 when he says that the Word became flesh and put up a tent among us? Well, as much as I don't like tents, there was a time when I was on a missions trip to Hungary where I spent 2 months living in a tent. And it wasn't out of necessity, okay? It's not like we couldn't find any better accommodations or anything like that. We were in the city of Budapest, okay? So it's not like there weren't other options. But we decided to go to a campground that was right in the heart of the city and put up tents for the summer because our mission was to share the gospel with people. And what we found was it was a lot easier to get to know people that you never met before if you're all camping out in the same spot and preparing your meals together and eating together around the fire. And as a result of that, we literally had the opportunity to share the gospel with hundreds of people and saw dozens of them come to Jesus. It was one of the most impactful mission trips I was ever on, and our entire strategy was to put up a tent. Not because tents are temporary, but because they provide an opportunity to get to know people. Could it be that the reason God puts up a tent among us is because he wants us to know him? Because he doesn't want us to have the kind of relationship where getting to know each other is awkward and there's no real opportunity to connect. Could it be that God wants to dwell with us in such a way that it invites relationship instead of discourages it? That draws us to him instead of scaring us away? Could that be part of the reason why God came as a baby? So we wouldn't be frightened by his arrival, but be drawn to him instead? Just like a little baby tends to draw people in, Jesus also came in a way that literally drew people in, whether it was the shepherds or the wise men, or all of us here this morning. God's desire has always been to be with us. And the miracle of the Incarnation, this event that we celebrate every Christmas, happened in such a way as to fulfill that desire. By removing the obstacle that stood between us, which was our sin, and by arriving in a way that encourages us to come to him, not to run in fear, but to instead draw near.